You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
So how did Jack the Ripper do it? He waited in shadows. He watched, probably for days, to see where prostitutes went, how long it took them, whether they were drunk or whether they were sober, whether they spent time in the dark spots between the gas lamps that gave off barely any light at all. He would wait, and he would wait. A face maybe well known, or maybe a stranger, in between the lamps, in that dark spot where no one can see. And then, as his heart began to beat faster and faster, he'd see her, an ordinary woman, someone like your sister, like your mother, like your daughter, walking past. His heart would beat faster and faster again until it came close to bursting point. She was there, looking good between two lamps. She was in the shadow, and in the darkest part of that twilight, he'd strike. We've waited a long time for this. This, to anybody, is a dream come true. Or is it a nightmare come true? Tonight we're walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. At the present moment I'm going down one of the back alleys where Jack plied his trade. And I think it's easy at this time of night when the light starts to dim. When in the buildings to my left and to my right I can see the lights of people getting on with their day-to-day business. And yet, it's in a place like this, when exactly the same things were happening, where people were getting ready for bed, where putting their children to sleep, they were enjoying a chat in front of a cosy fire, that right underneath their windows, someone was hacking the life out of someone. A woman directly beneath their window would scream, would howl, as a hand went across her mouth. She was dragged to the ground, and then they started to hack away, to rip open the stomach, to pull out the viscera, and mutilate her in a way that up until then had been unheard of in any civilized society. The sky at the present moment is really dark here in Whitechapel, and it's strange because when you're in a place that you don't know, things get a little bit more terrifying. But imagine if this was the place where you lived, a place where you plied your trade. And the strange thing is that most of the women we're going to be talking about, some of you may have already prejudged prostitutes. Some of you may think people of no value at all, and if one or two of them were killed, well, what's the problem? Well, these were just ordinary women, many of them women whose husbands had left them with children, and they had to pay for a roof over their head. Now, how are they going to do it? Many of them worked in places like workhouses and mills, and it wasn't enough, so they had to sell their bodies. And imagine if you were a mother raising children, is that not something that you would have considered? The easiest money to make. And yet you were doing it just outside your own front door, a place where you felt completely safe. Well, Whitechapel wasn't safe. It was the place frequented by Jack the Ripper. Tonight, not only are we going to walk in his footsteps, we're going to name Jack the Ripper for the first time, and I'm going to give you good reason why you should know the name of this man. An infamous character, and yet he's always been in the shadows, in secret. And yet tonight, we're going to shine a torch in his face. I'm going to give you the names of all of the people who are genuinely considered to be Jack the Ripper. I'm going to give you all of the evidence. We're going to do proper forensic tests. We're going to talk to profilers who work out exactly who is most likely to be the killer. And by the end of tonight's show, you, not me, you, will be able to unmask the most infamous killer in British history. Tonight, together, you and I, walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
In 1888, the idea of touring Whitechapel on foot would have struck most Victorians as sheer folly. A dismal, densely populated slum, it was home to the outcasts of society who eked out a meagre living not far from the hallowed halls of government.
The East End was London's poor quarter, and it was also the area identified with poverty and social problems. Life was hard. Life had, if it had pleasures, they were very immediate, they were momentary.
The presence of such squalor in the celebrated capital of the British Empire deeply troubled Victorian author Thomas Henry Huxley.
I assure you I found nothing worse, nothing more degrading, nothing so hopeless, nothing nearly so intolerably dull and miserable as life in the East End of London.
You've got to sort of look at the East End as sort of a maze of houses, tiny streets, people living 7, 8, 9 in a room, overcrowded tenements, living above cesspits. The children, 55% of them are dead before the age of 5. The women, they can't get work, so they prostitute themselves.
East End prostitutes earned very little. It was a very shabby kind of prostitution, perhaps in a lodging house, often sexual encounters in the streets.
So notorious was the area, it was known as the evil quarter mile. Now that same quarter mile draws amateur sleuths and curiosity seekers who walk many of the same streets and see many of the same sights as the world's first widely known serial killer.
Most of the Ripper's victims were women in their 40s who for one reason or another had abandoned lovers, husbands, boyfriends, families and taken a living on the streets. In appearance, their faces were puffy from drinking too much gin. They had cuts and bruises on their faces. They had teeth missing. You could buy an East End prostitute for 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread.
Tonight, Jack is back. Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Alan Robson with you. At the present moment, I'm down a back alley and I'm in a dark outbuilding with crinkly wooden latches, and the door is just kind of hanging off its hinges a little bit, and there's big boxes around and about the place. And this is typical of exactly how it was back then. You know, at the present moment, everything's been moderned up. We're talking over 100 years ago. And yet once you get into a back alley late at night, you begin to feel what it must have been like to literally walk in Jack the Ripper's footsteps. But who was he? How can any man rip women to pieces and yet remain invisible in the most crowded city in Europe? Was it the infamous Masonic plot? Was it a conspiracy to protect a member of the royal family? So many questions, so many misguided opinions, and frankly a subject that is surrounded by so much spin and innuendo that the truth has become almost inconsequential. Do we prefer to wonder at the incredible disappearing act of one of humanity's most sadistic butchers? Or deep down, do we want to know the name of the man who was Jack the Ripper? Well, you will uncover the truth here and now. Over the years, we've all watched countless movies, all claiming to reveal the killer, yet if you follow the evidence, they all actually fall well short. So let's begin with the obvious contenders. I'm going to get into a car and I'm going to head to the site of the first murder. And as we travel, I'm going to give you a list of the people that most folk consider to be the Ripper. You've got to listen to that evidence and you've got to decide for yourself. We're heading out of one alley in Whitechapel, the place where the first murder took place. is only a few hundred yards down the road, and we're going to start there. But was that first killing the first time that Jack the Ripper took out his knife and decided he was going to try and end someone's life? Well, if you're reading a book on Jack the Ripper and you hear that he killed 5 women or 6 women, depending on which book you read, we're going to show you that Jack the Ripper did far more than that. But anyway, Kenny is my official driver. Let's get in, Kenny, if we can. Here is the vehicle. Let us get in. Oh dear. Right. Hang on. Let's just put all of the... Problem with this being live is you hear a lot of the galumping about that you traditionally wouldn't. Let's get it fired up. Fabulous. Thank you. And, okay, we're on our way. And, right, so who are these people that we would consider to be Jack the Ripper? Well, the first one, and the most famous one, I suppose, is the Duke of Clarence, Prince Eddie, as he was known. He was the second son of King Edward VII, and his name has become synonymous with the Ripper. Now, why was that? Well, first of all, he was suspected of being bisexual, and coach drivers speak of his penchant for enjoying the company of working boys and working girls. One doctor close to the royal said that the prince had contracted syphilis from his friends, and this had transformed him into a criminal lunatic with violent tendencies. His doctor, Sir William Gull, was said to have hushed up many of his attacks on staff and public alike. The other theory was that Prince Eddie married a common shop girl, and she had a child. The Prime Minister ordered fellow Freemason Sir William Gull to mastermind the cover-up, and this involved the woman's murder hidden amongst a serial killer's victims. Gull was said to have drugged the girl to make her feeble-minded and then placed her in a sanatorium for the rest of her days. Yet the nanny, Mary Kelly, was one of the Ripper's victims, and he hatched a blackmail plot with her prostitute acquaintances. However, no child was ever uncovered, so the story sounds like merely scuttlebutt and gossip. The story of how Gull and a fellow doctor set out to silence them was later uncovered as a hoax. Then the press started suggesting that the prince had impregnated Mary Kelly. Yet according to her autopsy, she was not with child. Now, it is true that the prince had a room in Watling Street in Whitechapel, where he and his fellow aristocrats could wear disguises to walk amongst ordinary people and frequent with prostitutes. And there was no proof of the orgies and violence that the press had intimated. All this, and still no one looks at the basic evidence. Was Prince Edward, the Duke of Clarence, without an alibi for his whereabouts on the nights that these women were killed? The prince had an alibi for every evening except one. On one occasion, he was in Scotland, 350 miles from the scene of the crime. But could he be the Ripper? And did he use his power and position to gather those around him prepared to lie for him? If you think about it, look at the Princess Diana. Was she murdered? Was there a major cover-up? Was there a hush-up there? We know the power that the royals have. So could it be the Duke of Clarence? In the 1990s, a Sunday newspaper claimed they knew who the Ripper was, and they proclaimed an exclusive. They named Dr. Rosalind Donston as the killer. None of the hugely well-researched Ripper anthologies even mentioned this man. So is there any proof at all of his involvement? He was born Robert Dunstan Stevenson, the son of a mill owner in Hull. He was a bit of a character, a drug addict, an alcoholic, a troublemaker, Satanist, and a doctor. Well, Dunstan did live in Whitechapel in 1888, so he would have a great knowledge of the tiny streets. The murders were planned with great precision, and this mysterious doctor had been a soldier early in his life. As a doctor, his knowledge of anatomy would certainly have been sufficient to find the various and specific organs targeted by the Ripper. Whilst working as a journalist, Dunstan claimed to know the Ripper and gave inside knowledge. His knowledge of the occult said that the 7 murder sites, when plotted on a map, fell in a fallen cross, an upside-down crucifix, declaring the killings as a sacrifice to Satan. Dunstan said the Ripper was obviously trying to release a wave of negative psychic energy to give himself incredible dark powers. The doctor's 20 years of studying the dark arts, but Was he merely lost in a drug-addicted fantasy, or was he really writing about himself? The world-famous black magician Aleister Crowley claimed to have a box belonging to Jack the Ripper, full of blood-stained ties worn by the Ripper during each killing, yet the box originally belonged to Dr. Rosalind Dunstan. This still does not prove him to be the Ripper, only that he had a fascination with the killings. Was it merely a ruse to give him status within the occult community? Here is where the only so-called evidence of his involvement began. A woman, unnamed, supposedly Dunstan's lover, claimed to have found blood-covered ties, then admitted to the press that he had told her how he'd administered chloroform to stop the woman struggling and always ripped them from behind to avoid getting blood on him. Yet if this is so, why soak his tie and leave evidence if he'd tried so hard to avoid blood transference? The police never interviewed this woman and admitted that a journalist had told them she had been created to give credence to a theory. The doctor eventually succumbed to his advanced drug use. Illness claimed him. He remained bedbound, unable to walk or talk. He was the perfect man to point the finger at, as no one knows how or when he died. Was he merely a fantasist trying to boost his position in the occult world by linking himself to Jack the Ripper? Or was he the one responsible for those horrific murders? As you see, with only 2 suspects, 3 if you include the Prince's man Dr. William Gull, it's already far from simple. So who else do we regularly mention when we're searching for a suspect? In recent years, the favourite became a man called Montague Druid. He was a sexually insane barrister who loved sex with prostitutes, and his vigorous and violent sex acts with them, including sodomy and choking, brought him to the attention of the police. Not long after the last Ripper murder, he threw himself into the Thames and drowned himself. Was this an admission of guilt, or merely the inevitable result of insanity? More questions, fewer answers. But tonight we'll know who Jack the Ripper is. The police believed the killer had to be a doctor. Nothing could sway them until the name of William Bury fell across their desk. He was a murderer, and he was hanged for it. Following his marriage, he had a punch-up with his new wife in their digs, and he was stopped in the nick of time for cutting her throat with a razor. During the Ripper's frenzy of killings, he walked into a police station to say his wife was dead. On visiting Bury's house, they found writing on the wall claiming, "Jack the Ripper is behind this door." Another saying, "The Ripper lives in the cellar." And in the cellar, the police found his wife's body. Ellen's body was in a trunk. She'd been strangled and terribly mutilated. Her intestines were tugged through a gaping hole in her stomach. Bury was hanged in Dundee in 1889. His vicious temper brought great attention to himself. Surely he could not be the cool-headed Ripper. What about George Chapman? He poisoned his 3 wives and owned a barber shop in the middle of Whitechapel. He knew all of the lanes and all of the back alleys. Following his arrest for killing his 3rd wife, the police exhumed his first 2, and he was charged with their murders as well. In Poland, Chapman had worked as a surgeon, so he knew his way around the human body. Yet could a man who enjoyed the slow strangling of women really change his modus operandi to tearing them to pieces? One of the surprise suspects was a guy called Aaron Cohen, who was arrested during a raid on a brothel. He showed extreme violence whilst in the cells, and he was placed in the Colney Hatch Asylum, where he attacked guards, nurses, and tried to destroy his room. Some say this man was also known as Nathan Kaminsky, driven mad through syphilis, given to him by a prostitute. There's a motive, a good motive, to want payback. Or is it merely a coincidence? It's also thought that this man is often called Leather Apron, as he worked as a skinner in a slaughter yard. There were many others, hundreds, including Dr. Thomas Cream, a doctor and abortionist, who poisoned 4 prostitutes. There was Frederick Deeming, who murdered his first wife and 4 children before becoming a prostitute addict. Dr. Pedachenko, a Russian doctor, was supposedly sent to London to murder women to embarrass the British government. More questions, yet no one ever seems to have looked at the basics. Who was in Whitechapel at the time? Who would lie to the police for no reason? Who knew the victims? Who was seen by the public with the victims? And who had a motive to kill them? The only way to find out is to start from the very beginning and walk in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
I think he was wearing an overcoat, but I cannot be sure. He was a man over 40. As far as I could tell, he seemed a little taller than the deceased.
He had a hard billycock hat. He had a blotchy face and a carroty moustache.
He was a fine-looking man. He wore an overcoat with a cape, high hat, not a silk one, and a Gladstone bag.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Right, this is it, Kenny. If you just joined us, Alan Robson with you live. And we talk about grisly trails. We've taken you across the world to see where Dracula lives, where Countess Bathory lives. And we are now on the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. And as we get out, perhaps the only way to get a true feeling for the real horror of what happened in Whitechapel is to be on the streets late at night, through until the early hours of the morning. The London police advised me that this is actually not the safest area to be. And yet, here we are, late at night, and that's now. So, with one or two people still walking around at this time of night, this is how it must have been when there were so few street lamps, a myriad of small alleys, extreme poverty, and so many murders that the police could frankly not cope. Well, that's my first point. So many murders. And that gives us our first direction. Daniel Steen of New York worked as a criminologist. He's an expert in forensics, being used on numerous high-profile cases as a profiler. He suggested our first course of action.
No murderer as brutal and driven as Jack the Ripper just goes out there and kills with precision and planning. You always find that they practice first, or have episodes as a child to hint at the direction they're going. I've looked at the Ripper case, and I see a man immersed in the people he's preying on. An anonymous face that all around thinks pretty ordinary and safe. A white male in his late 20s to early 40s, who perhaps had a mother complex or was abused as a child. This person probably indulged in cruelty against animals, and I can assure you that his first official attack was not his first crime. I'm certain that he had killed before, but in London at that time the authorities only ever pulled out all the stops when someone from elite society was the victim. Life for the poor was extremely tough, and if these lower classes chose to kill each other, more often than not the murderer would get away with it. Even in bloody murder, money talks.
On hearing that, my investigation brought me to New Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police records for the time and wading through all of the murders in the area for 5 years before the first official Ripper murder. And there they are. Unsolved cases that bear definite signs of the practice attack. The first was not a murder. I don't know whether you can hear it, but even down this little alley there's a few trees here and rather damp leaves underneath my feet. So what could have been Jack the Ripper's first attack? Well, the first was not a murder. It happened on Saturday, the 25th of February in 1888, and this rather plain factory worker called Annie Millwood was found bleeding on the street and taken to hospital, suffering from a dozen knife wounds to her legs, torso, and her hands bore defensive wounds for the savage attack she had defended so bravely. She lived in White Row and was a war widow and known as a gentle soul. Now, it has to be said that Annie Millwood, bless her, this is where she lived. Directly where we are. There's a bush to my left-hand side, which is a very sharp and spindly holly bush that's been here for several years. And who's to say that this bush was not witness to that very first assault? White Row, where war widows lived. She was known as a very gentle woman, She told police that a rather ordinary-looking man had simply walked up to her, drawn an extremely sharp clasp knife from his pocket, knocked her to the ground and began stabbing her. In a shadowy corner of the street, far from the dim streetlights and in the London fog, there were no witnesses. Months later, she was released from the workhouse infirmary, where she simply dropped dead. It was thought that the internal damage had weakened her, and the official verdict from the coroner was, the woman died from a sudden effusion into the pericardium from the rupture of the left pulmonary artery through ulceration. The police filed this under death by natural causes, so it was lost in the files, never surfacing during the entire Ripper investigation. Despite a fairly detailed description given to the police, the victim declared this man to be dressed in swarthy clothes, obviously not from any kind of wealthy background. She also added that her attacker was a man aged in his early 30s, with an ordinary face with a moustache, around 5'7" and with bad skin, a description that was miles away from the man that the police would spend their entire investigation searching for. So was this the only Jack the Ripper rehearsal, where he perhaps lost his courage and failed to finish her off? Would that frighten him off, or merely make him more determined? Well, there were numerous other possibilities, like a seamstress who was attacked by a man in his 30s with a moustache and bad skin. And it's directly across the road from where I am now. And hang on, you've got to be a little bit careful because there's still one or two cars around, as you can probably hear. I'm along a concrete wall, and directly above my head there's ivy kind of brushing my head. And it's a little bit damp as well, I'm getting the odd drip. And as I look to my left-hand side, there's a row of houses with probably 3 stories. It's a very modern building. It obviously hasn't been around here for very long. And along the back, there's that tiny alley leading to garages. Now, back in 1888, these would be tiny little houses, all stuck together in a long terrace, dirty, scruffy homes for people who didn't have an awful lot of money. And yet it's along this alley, and I'm taking you along that alley as we speak. Just at the opposite side of the block there are cars, and yet here I am at the place where the second attack took place. She was a seamstress. She said she was attacked by a man in his 30s with a moustache and bad skin who had demanded money and waved a knife at her, finally plunging it into her throat twice. Now, the lady's name was Ada Wilson, and she refused to hand over any cash, and her screams brought neighbours running from all directions. And if you look along this tiny alley, you can imagine 40 or so tiny little slum dwellings, all side by side. There's no way that anybody making any kind of noise would not be able to hear what was going on directly outside their living room window. So the neighbours came running. The man was lucky to escape. Was this a coincidence? Or was the Ripper flexing his muscles and seeing just how far he could go? Now, if we judge him purely on the 6 established murders, he appears to be a devilishly intelligent killer. Yet looking back, he could well have been rather clumsy and cack-handed in his earlier assaults. Another woman known as Margaret was grabbed from behind in Whitechapel in March 1888. She said she felt the man fumbling in his pocket, unable to get something out. At first she thought the man had rape on his mind, a remarkably common crime in London at that time. This was a time when poor men could not afford even the price of a cheap working girl. However, she heard something metal fall on the wet cobbles, and as the man released his grasp to retrieve what she presumed to be a knife, as he did, she ran forward, and on spotting several friends, screamed out that she was being attacked. When the men reached her attacker, he'd gone. This was never reported to the police, only coming to light in the late 1920s, when the woman was on her deathbed. It was a textbook Ripper attack. From behind, so he couldn't be splashed with blood. One attack every month seemed to be the Ripper's technique. And on a bank holiday, Tuesday the 3rd of April, Emma Smith would be assaulted. Another Ripper crime that no one has attributed to the Ripper. We're going to drive there next, and then I'm going to tell the story of what happened. You need all the information, so tonight you can unmask Jack the Ripper.
Fingerprinting and other now standard tools of detection was still a long way off.
It's going to be another 14 years before you get the first fingerprint conviction. Similarly, in 1888, the difference could not be told between animal and human blood. So you could have a situation where the murderer could be standing here and the victim could be lying there. The murderer could be covered in the victim's blood. He could have left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. With the state of scientific knowledge that existed in 1888, there was no way you could put the two together. The murderer has quite literally got to be caught in the act of murder.
It seems we're a bit further away from the car than we thought. There's Kenny just starting the engine ahead of me, and I got a little bit further away from the car. That was actually quite scary. This is the City of London. If you're wondering where Whitechapel is, it's in the East End of the city. And hang on, I've got to put my seatbelt on. Sorry for the umming and the ahhing. You're going to get a bit of that tonight while we buckle up. And oh dear, we are heading off. Now, it's not too far from here. The thing about Whitechapel, even back then in 1888, everywhere was pretty close to everywhere else. Everybody knew one another. And this is the reason why I can't understand how nobody knew who Jack the Ripper was. If you live in a close community, for those of you that live in the tiny villages, places like Chopwell, say, or maybe Uffham in Northumberland, or down to the little tiny villages around Bishop Auckland. There's loads of tiny villages around every big town or city, and everybody knows everybody. If there's a stranger in that area, you know them at once. You clock them at once. And you... Hang on, we're just coming to the end. Yes, it's along here. We're heading in the right direction. Turn left along here, and it's... I think it's you cut across this road if you can. Be careful, because there's other cars swinging round on the left-hand side. Terraced houses to the left and to the right. Sorry, whoops. Yes, it's up here. And bit of a roller coaster because, oh, hang on, speed humps. Oh, didn't expect that. That was a shock to the system. And we're looking for a place to park just a little bit further up here. And I actually think it's the next turning to your right ahead, if the map that I've got is any good at all. And this is perfect. This is exactly where I need to be. And hang on, I've got to unbuckle now. It's a bit of a clart when you do it live. We could have had this really silky smooth, but you want the truth. To find the truth, we have to walk... Oh, there it is. We have to... Nearly got killed. We have to... He was a little bit closer than I'd kind of anticipated. The thing is, at this time of night, obviously, when you're walking around where people live and where shops are, people are looking out their windows. I'm looking directly up from where I'm standing, and there's people looking out the window. I am not going to be deterred, because I'm here to tell you about what happened on that bank holiday, where the Ripper's technique continued. One attack a month, we mentioned. And so was the case. Along tiny little lanes like this, 2-storey buildings to the left and to the right, long chimney stacks, small gardens in front of the walls. And it's along here that Emma Smith, a 45-year-old widow with 2 children left, and she... Oh, I'm just being careful because there's another car coming. I don't want to be killed. And when you're walking along the road, it is so easy. This area is, if you're thinking of buying a house, this is an area that you could kind of comfortably kind of leave behind. But she left her lodgings. You got to remember, she's a widow of 45. She had no job. Yet she did manage to keep her family in food. And yet, how did she make her money? Well, frankly, she was almost certainly a prostitute. In the early hours, one of her fellow working girls, Maggie Hayes, saw her talking to a man in his early 30s, about 5'8". Have you noticed? All 3 attacks, he's around 5'8". He's wearing a dark, well-worn suit with a small scarf around his throat. An hour or so later, Emma was walking home when she was followed, robbed, and raped by 3 men. So did the Ripper have allies? Well, on getting home, it was obvious she needed to go to hospital. Her face was bruised, her right ear had practically been torn off, and she complained of a pain down below. The poor woman had a blunt object, perhaps a silver-topped cane, forced inside her, causing her perineum to rip, needing 11 stitches. Emma told police her story but fell into a coma and died of her appalling injuries. It's generally thought that it was a gang preying on prostitutes who would not allow them to be their pimp. Could the Ripper have been a member of a gang? Did anybody ever ask? Or maybe the Ripper was not just one man. Perhaps there were 3 Jack the Rippers. There were many more assaults, rapes and murders, most so badly investigated that there's no way of knowing whether the Ripper was involved or not. Some corpses at a local cemetery that had been recently buried had been mutilated around the lower body. Did the Ripper dig up bodies so that he could practice his mutilation? Did anybody ask? Did anybody question the people who lived around there? Never. But we're asking the questions tonight. I'm positive that the Ripper's first actual victim, not a practice victim, but actual victim, was a woman called Martha Tabram, who was found murdered by a dock worker at 4:30 on Tuesday the 7th of August 1888, approximately 250 yards from where I'm standing tonight. We're walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. The more you hear, the better chance you're going to have to name that Ripper tonight. Tonight we will all know who Jack the Ripper was. Alan Robson live on an amazingly cold and chilly and murky Whitechapel, London, as you and I tonight together are walking in the footsteps of the Ripper.
For the women who kept going out on the streets, for those casual prostitutes, life was already a gamble. They were living on the margins economically. That gamble just got harder and the stakes just got much more drastic.
They were on the streets all night long, right through the murders. Desperation, lack of money, they had to be on the streets trying to earn a living, and some of them were so hopeless that they said, well, that, you know, they'd rather fall victim to Jack the Ripper than to have to jump off a bridge and commit suicide.
You little bugger! That nearly got me there! What's the matter with people? You can tell we're not far from the airport either! Oh, hang on, police van. Hide your microphone. Evening, officer. Evening, all. Oh, cheapers. Well, to be quite honest, I'm not remotely sad to see a policeman in this part of the world. That's not bad, so we are heading... Oh, hang on. You nearly took me bloody door off! Alan Robson, we're in London. We're on the trail of Jack the Ripper, and I know we're jaunting in and out of cars. We have to do that to make sure that we can cover all of the bases for you. And the next place that we're going to, if you can imagine, in days gone by, just before we pull away... I know where we're heading, but I know what it used to look like too. It's Gunthorpe Street. It was formerly known, and back then in 1888 it was known as George Yard in Whitechapel, the George Yard buildings. Now those buildings, why was it called that? Well, because the man, George Yard, owned a business, and he commissioned those buildings to be built so that the people that worked for him had somewhere to live in Whitechapel, a place where everybody was very, very poor indeed. The spot where Martha Tabram was murdered. Even at the time, it was a 3-storey building with curved arch windows, and it looked very, very dark. And a lot of people, because they were frankly ashamed of how awful and poverty-stricken they were, and they didn't have any furniture, they didn't have paintings and pictures on their wall like the modern day families have. Even the poorest families have these things. Back then, some of them were even sleeping on straw. They had absolutely nothing, not even a pot to pee in. They were very, very poor. So many of them blackened their windows with dubbing, that you would normally put on your shoes or your boots in the 40s and 50s. They would blacken their windows so that nobody could see in. But that made their existence very, very dark and dingy, and the only light in that room would be a very, very dim candle, because this is before everybody had electricity in their homes. So you'll understand, this is a really, really dark place, and the buildings were very, very dark too. And the George Yard buildings, now Gunthorpe Street, is where we're heading next. And it's just along here, we're not too far away, but Martha Tabram, as I say, she was murdered by Jack the Ripper. I'm absolutely positive. It just reeks of the Ripper's hand. And hang on, there's one or two little speed bumps around the side streets where we're going now. You go to the end of here, and Gunthorpe Street, I believe, is on your right-hand side, and then you turn, you go along there for about 50, 60 yards, and then it's down the next street to your right. Oh, but there's one or two more speed bumps. At this time of night, you can actually picture somebody taking a life. It's dark, it's nasty, it's spitting on a little bit to rain. Directly ahead of me there's one of the slightly posher buildings with lights outside it and huge Roman-style porticos round the front. And isn't it strange that even back then, that building's more than 100, 150 years old, that building would have been here around the time that Jack the Ripper was doing his thing. The buildings, the streets, the roads bear testament to the horrors that happened here, and we're guiding you through to them. We have the sound of the Ripper victims on tape, because before we came here we asked our guide to place tape recording devices in buildings close to where the Ripper murders were taking place, and you can hear those on tonight's show. Alan Robson's Night Owls live, and I believe we want to go to the next road on our right from here. We're passing one or two odd shops. It's very dowdy. This is it. It's a very, very small avenue. There's one or two, quite a lot of cars this time of night. You'll understand that some of the pubs are getting close to turfing all of their people out, and a lot of headlights heading to the left and to the right, and we're trying to sneak in between them. I think you get between these next two. Go on, it's a police car. Eek. Right, and it's down at the end of here, right at the very bottom, away from the road, where Martha Tabram, bless her, was found. Here it is, if you'd like to turn the vehicle around, because this is kind of like a cul-de-sac type of place at the present moment. There's one or two roadworks, and just up here, this is very good indeed. Yeah, this will do. This is exactly where it happened. This is where Martha Tabram's... Right, so let me just get out, and again, apologies for the noises of seatbelts and stuff going, but if you're going to do it properly. And let's go and see where she was killed. Again, this is a dark and dingy part of Whitechapel. And here we are. And this is it. This is precisely where she died. At the very end of the street, there's still one or two buildings where cars are flying by. And you got to remember that this was 4:40 in the morning that they found a body. A workman saw the helpless soul lying on the hard concrete stairs on a first-floor landing of George Yard. She was on her back with her legs apart, and an ever-growing pool of blood that trickled down the steps. And when the police officer, Thomas Barrett, arrived at the scene, he presumed it was a sexual assault that had gone wrong. Dr. Timothy Killeen was called to the scene to observe the body and pronounce her dead. And I must admit, it must have been a horrific thing, first thing in the morning, to be roused out of your bed just to come across this woman, torn and ripped. In Timothy Colleen's report, he declared that she'd been brutally stabbed 39 times and may also have had something inserted into her intimate areas. The post-mortem would reveal all. In the police constable's report, he also said that he'd questioned a man around 2 o'clock in the morning who was late 20s, early 30s, with a moustache and bad skin. He'd found him standing in a darkened doorway. He told the policeman that his friend had gone off with a whore, and he was waiting for him. This was a common enough practice in that part of town, so the constable just walked on. The woman was murdered around 2:45 in the morning. It seems a number of others had walked past Martha's body, having seen it. When it was dark in Whitechapel, slumped bodies in doorways were a common sight. You've got to remember, people like to drink, and a lot of them would just be caved in on a doorstep, sleeping it off. In the coroner's court, Dr. Killeen told the throng that there were 22 stab wounds to Martha's torso. Her left lung had been burst with 5 wounds, causing it to crash, and the right lung was sliced into 2 pieces. The liver had 5 deep incisions, the stomach had been penetrated 6 times, the spleen twice, and there'd been 1 forceful stab wound in her heart. There was 1 deep wound in the vagina, and yet the doctor did not mention the wounds to her throat and her thighs. It was thought that the woman did not struggle, making the doctor believe that she was perhaps rendered unconscious before the savage killer went to work on her. The following day, the press declared the killer had medical knowledge. Yet the doctor made no mention of this, and he didn't think that the killer had any medical knowledge. A fellow surgeon said that the wounds seemed to be scattered in the general direction of the various organs, as if he was attempting to hit them all. That was surely anatomy for beginners. It was not anatomy like a doctor would know. A doctor would be able to puncture the body in precisely the place. So the press had done something very similar to what we're experiencing now. As you know, the Yorkshire Ripper, the hoaxer, the alleged hoaxer, has been arrested. And it was because of that hoax that the police went looking in the wrong place. Well, the press had said that the killer was a medical man. The police thought he was well-to-do, and that's where they were going to go looking. A local army barracks was investigated without anything conclusive. The body had been identified by her ex-husband, who'd left her because of her drinking. Enter Inspector Frederick Aberline, the main detective who would pursue Jack the Ripper, and he would later admit that he also believed that Martha was Jack the Ripper's first official victim, especially when Chief Inspector Swanson later admitted Martha had 9 separate stab wounds to her throat, given by a man standing behind her and throttling her whilst holding her down. Jack the Ripper was perfecting his technique.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes. Those used by slaughtermen might have caused them. Knives in the leather trade would not be long enough in the blade. The mode in which these portions were extracted showed anatomical knowledge. Obviously the work was that of an expert.
When Phillips' report was made public, it unleashed a frenzy of accusation. Immediately suspicion fell upon those who used knives in their work, like doctors, butchers and barbers.
A lot of people made out that he was a doctor, a surgeon. No, it's not that a surgeon, it's a surgeon. He was a hack. And, I think most people just hacking a body would find those sort of things anyway. They'd find the womb and things like that without any problem.
Later reports conflicted with Dr. Phillips' assertion. But by then, the court of public opinion, aided by the press, had turned to more convenient, non-English suspects.
What was also creating a stir was that the area, sort of in the 1880s, the area had got a large influx of immigrants, Jewish immigrants. Many of them were escaping from the pogroms in Tsarist Russia and in Eastern Europe. So the Jewish community was immediately being targeted. as one of their number being actually responsible for the murders. It was said no Englishman would do such a terrible thing, and so the Jews were immediately the scapegoat for the murders.
If you've just joined us, Alan Robson on the trail of Jack the Ripper. We've been driving around for what seems an age looking for the exact spot, and I think we're here now. 3 weeks later, maybe inspired by Martha Tabram, who was ripped horribly, Jack the Ripper started what many people describe as his official tour. It was just after 3:30 when Charlie Cross was walking to work, and he spotted a dirty tarpaulin in the gateway of Brown's stable yard in Bucks Row. And he knew that it would block the carts, so he was about to tug it out the way when he discovered it was actually a woman lying in a heap on the wet ground. His fellow worker Robert Paul saw him looking down and went to investigate. The obvious presumption was that it was another drunk who'd not made it home. On taking a closer look, they saw that skirts were raised, so then they agreed she'd probably been raped. The poor working girls at that time had no choice to accept that rape was a hazard of their profession, particularly in that part of Victorian London. On touching her hand, he knew she was dead. The cold chill of the skin. They pulled the woman's skirt down and walked, and by the time they'd found one, another constable had already uncovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols. As he shone a torch into a pale face, he could see that blood was still slowly oozing from her slit throat. Dr. Llewellyn determined that the woman had only been dead for about 30 minutes. We're just pulling into this precise place. We are now on the spot where that murder took place. As I said, the woman had only been dead for about 30 minutes, meaning that when she was first found, she was actually still alive and perhaps could have been saved. The mortuary had to be opened especially for the body to be taken in. The doctor discovered on lifting her skirt that the lower body had been terribly mutilated. The stomach had been torn open to reveal the intestines. The attendant vomited on seeing it, as Dr. Llewellyn admitted it was the most brutal case he'd ever seen. Her poor clothing speaks volumes for the social position of poor Mary Ann Nichols. She was wearing a tatty coat with brass buttons, a brown woolen frock, a cotton undergarment, 2 petticoats, a pair of stays, black wool stockings, and a pair of obviously second-hand men's boots. She had a battered and old straw bonnet, and one of her petticoats she had stolen from Lambeth Workhouse, as it still bore its name. All she had in her purse was a comb, a white handkerchief, and the broken corner from a mirror. At the post-mortem, Dr. Llewellyn's report was to the point, dramatically to the point.
The body was that of a female, 40 to 45 years of age. Her face was bruised with one mark running along the lower part of the jaw on the right-hand side. This mark may have been caused by a fist or the pressure of a thumb. Her tongue was also lacerated, so she was throttled. Another bruise on the left side was thought to be caused by fingers. On the left side of the neck, below the jaw, was an incision, 4 inches long, running from directly below the ear. The second cut, but deeper, an inch below, that one that went right across to the other ear. This had completely severed all the tissues down to the vertebrae, and the carotid arteries on both sides of the neck had been severed. It was a strong-bladed knife, moderately sharp, and had been used with great violence. On the lower part of the abdomen, there was a very deep wound that ran in a jagged manner, cutting through the tissue. There were 4 other cuts running downwards on the right side, the knife having been used violently. The killer has some rough anatomical knowledge, for he has attacked all the vital parts, yet this entire crime could easily have been committed in less than 5 minutes.
Later, the good doctor said he believed that he thought the killer may have been trying to obtain some of the dead woman's organs but had been disturbed. And this is backed up by the fact that when she was discovered, she was still alive, blood still flowing from her wound. It is almost certain that the Ripper saw the man walk into Buck's Row and escaped into the shadows before finishing his loathsome handiwork. And as I look around me, at the present moment, we got modern buildings, we have roads with cars on them, just the same as a street that you'd see anywhere across the United Kingdom. Yet back then, there was a double wooden door. Right next to it, there was a white-fronted building with a bay window that jutted out that had leaded glass. This was a place where people lived, and lived quite comfortably. It wasn't really posh, but it was certainly posher than most of the homes that these prostitutes had. And he'd murdered her right in front of a bay window. Did someone look out? Did somebody see the face of the Ripper? Once again, the press had a field day. Another killer who was obviously a doctor. Do you know, only the press can transform a rough knowledge into a professional surgeon. The police were being guided in the wrong direction. Once again, a busy and crowded part of London, yet nobody heard a sound. For years, those who lived in the wrong part of town had learned to ignore what goes on in the shadows. Gangs battling for control, robberies, rapes, sex with prostitutes, all things that decent people tried to distance themselves from. In yet another case, the police had no help, only hindrance of the press, directing them to some rich doctor. The poor residents were, of course, happy to blame the class divide and campaign against the police for not caring for the poor. At this time, there was no furore, no clamouring from the public to find the killer. In fact, the deaths of prostitutes was so commonplace, the local paper put the story on page 5, but it said that the killer ripped into her. Many believe that this was the beginning of the nickname that would live on forever. It would be the Ripper's next victim that would begin a frenzy of activity when the press realised it was Britain's first true serial killer, and a character they would make an international celebrity. Alan Robson with you, walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper, and with every step we take, we're getting closer to the man.
Jack the Ripper's not finished.
The discovery of Polly Nichols' body at 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row was in itself no cause for panic in the East End of London. Crime was an everyday fact of life here, and women were not uncommon victims.
Working class women were no strangers to violence. The East End was a rough place. Working class marriages were often abusive.
Still, even with a corpse, an approximate time of death, and knowledge of the weapon, the police had little to work with. Their inquiries produced no motive, no eyewitnesses, and no suspects. Within days, the search for Polly Nichols' murderer reached a dead end.
So she went to the market on the 8th of September looking for a customer, and was seen talking to a man who's described as a sort of foreign appearance, about in his 30s, wearing a deerstalker hat. They're seen talking outside number 29 Hanbury Street. The man is heard to ask, "Will you?" and Annie Chapman reply, "Yes."
There must be just something about the feeling you get when you kill. I've spoken to a lot of people over the years who've been in wars and they've fought, and I remember perhaps one of the most... What was that? Did you hear it? Jeez. We're walking down back alleys, and I've felt on numerous occasions, but never more forcibly than just there, almost the breath of someone on the back of your neck, and very occasionally, and I know it's quite chilly, you get a cold breeze that cuts straight through you like the soul of someone who's been murdered. Along these dark alleys with metal railings to my left-hand side, and people, as I say, just getting on with their business and living nearby. Maybe it's something to do with bloodlust that suddenly makes you want to kill again. You've murdered. You've got a kick out of such sadistic pleasure that you decide you have to kill again. And 9 days after his last murder, Jack the Ripper was ready to kill again. John Davis was a porter at Spitalfields Market, and this meant he had to be at work by 6:30 in the morning. So on leaving his digs at 5:45, as he walked down the yard, he saw someone lying between the steps and the fence. He bent down to see if it again was someone drunk, to discover the blood-soaked corpse of Annie Chapman. Even tonight you can hear, in Whitechapel, the police are being called. Inspector Joseph Chandler rushed to the scene. His graphic report demonstrated how the killer's barbarity was increasing, as was his celebrity. Chandler wrote,
I proceeded to 29 Hanbury Street and in the backyard found a woman lying on her back dead, left arm resting on her breast, legs drawn up, abducted, small intestines and flap of the abdomen lying on the right side, above the right shoulder attached by a cord to the rest of the intestines inside the body. 2 flaps of skin from the lower part of the abdomen were lying in a large quantity of blood above the left shoulder. The throat had been cut deeply from the left and back in a jagged manner around the throat.
Dr. Phillips would add to his report, the face was swollen as if beaten, and the tongue protruded through the front teeth. Next to the body was a torn fragment from a shawl, a small tooth comb, a pocket comb, an envelope with a stamp from the Sussex Regiment, and above them on the wall a huge smear of blood as if the killer had sought to wipe his hand. 3 days later, a man known as Leather Apron, John Pisa, there were several people called Leather Apron, but Pisa was arrested and they recovered 5 long knives in his property. As he worked with knives in his profession, this was not really a surprise, but it may keep the heat off the police while they continued their investigations. During the inquest, Annie's last movements were described. When Annie had returned at 1:45 a.m, she settled down in front of a low fire to eat a baked potato. She'd been asked for her DOS money but couldn't pay. She'd explained that she couldn't find a John that night. Yet she told a friend, who happened to be a local night watchman, that she'd been to see her sister in Vauxhall. Leather Apron, at least the pizza version, was released without charge, and the police arrested Jacob Eisenschmidt, as some Londoners were claiming that no Englishman could possibly be responsible for such horrific murders. The press demanded that the murderous foreigner must be found, and then declared that the mutilations were obviously done by a doctor. Many of the police of the day were simple men, short on training, and many of these men viewed the police force as a way to get out of the squalor of their relatively poor lives. I think many of them were affected by the blanket newspaper coverage that always seemed to steer them the wrong way, especially as they lived amongst the people who were constantly complaining, forever complaining about Europeans living amongst them, or the sizable Jewish population who always appeared well off whilst they were in rags. And it was here, where we're standing tonight, you and I, together, Whitechapel, dark trees standing like giants at the end of rows of houses, little snatches of garden in front of terraced homes. The press had a field day, especially when the autopsy details were published, as the Ripper's mode of murder was fully exposed. He'd found a shadowy spot in that dark yard. He'd punched her to the ground, leaving bruises to her temple, and began to strangle her until she was semi-conscious. Then, before she could struggle, slit her throat from behind. This would stop the blood spurt from hitting him. Some of Annie's rings were missing. Yet this could have been from a previous day, as often working girls had to pawn belongings to pay rent. It could also have been anyone passing, as many dead and drunken bodies in the street had been robbed by locals desperately short of money and living in extreme poverty. At that time, the press were not told that an attempt had been made to cut off Annie's head. This suggests that the Ripper certainly was not a butcher or a tanner who had a simple technique for doing this. Any doctor would also have known. The newspapers only heard that the uterus, vagina, and 2/3 of the bladder had been entirely removed. This led to headlines like, "Dr. Death back on the streets of Whitechapel. The Ripper returns." The police, to their credit, were trawling to catch this psychopath, visiting the Sussex Regiment to find out who knew Annie. Their handwriting was examined. None matched the envelope. Then it was discovered that those envelopes were bought by locals because the nearest post office was miles away. To add to the misconception, Dr. Phillips was asked outright if the killer was a member of his profession. He said this, "Well, the murderer does seem to have anatomical evidence." Yet later in his conversation, he added, "I think it's most unlikely." So there we have it. The police were looking for a doctor. Yet all of the doctors that had examined the corpses said it wasn't a doctor doing the killing. But the press kept on. And it's across this road. It's quite a busy road. You're just going to have to bear with us for a moment while we get across this road. And we're heading towards where the next murder took place. It's just down here to our right. It's a very busy road. I'm going for it. Right across here. Tiny buildings to my left-hand side with small doors that look too small for people who are 6 feet. The doors are approximately 5 foot. They're on my left-hand side. The windows to my left are shuttered. Upstairs you've got windows with lead. You know, the little lead tiny windows. A lot of cars here. Driving too fast, in my personal opinion. Few shops to my left-hand side. And we turn off to my left, where there's a house with lots of greenery and ivy climbing up it, and any windows open, you'll have spiders in there, no question. And we're heading down here. You know, most Ripper writers over the years only ever dealt with the 6 Ripper murders as shown in the records from Victorian times. Yet why didn't they look into the records of the day to see what may have been missed or hidden? For just over a week after Annie's murder, there was another attack here on Commercial Road in Whitechapel. A prostitute called Susan Ward had worked hard that night, dozens of clients, and with her hard-earned cash, she'd decided to get herself completely drunk at the establishment that we're just walking into the courtyard of right now. It is still a restaurant and still it was a tavern at the time. She was seen by dozens of witnesses staggering around, singing and making a fool of herself. She was so drunk some men were having their way with her in turns while she giggled and said, "Help yourself." Yet as any hardened drinker will tell you, there are things that will sober you up in a hurry. As she walked home in anything but a straight line, a man lurched out of the shadows, grasping her throat. She saw a knife in his hand, and suddenly her strength and wits returned. He tried to slice open her throat, but she put her arm up, and the knife cut into that. His grip on her wavered as she writhed herself free and screamed. It was a busy night, and the footsteps of people running towards the sound forced the attacker to run off. Trying to keep down the panic sweeping the streets, the police told the press that this was unrelated to the Ripper. Yet it absolutely fits the pattern of weekend attacks. The technique was precise, and now there was a living witness. Spin from the police was making it hard to solve the crime, particularly when added to the downright lies told by the press and the gossip on the streets. Misinformation was coming forward from all sides. Yet what did Susan Ward actually remember through her drunken haze? Well, a friend, whose name happened to be Elizabeth Snedden, was told by Susan that her attacker was wearing a tatty dark suit. The face was familiar, as if she'd seen him around, yet it was filled with a fury that made it harder to recognise. Apparently the prostitute may even have asked her pimp for members of their gang to find him and sort him out. I'm fairly certain this was another unsuccessful attack, whilst the history books choose to make the Ripper seem infallible. Yet had this attack been thoroughly investigated, it could have been his last attack. And it's down here, 2 weeks later, Commercial Road, just around the corner from this road as we head to the bottom of it. The bottom of it, it's actually a little bit further down from here, but we'll head that way all the same, cutting across the road to a little narrow path where it's fairly brightly lit, because if you think about it, oh yes, here we are. If you think about it, there's a street light. I'm standing beneath a street light now. I'm not available, it doesn't matter how much you offer. Although there are still prostitutes here in Whitechapel. And the streetlights are now very, very bright. And yet, if you can think of the day, it would be a really dark gas lamp with a few moths around it and the thick smog and fog that London is famous for. It would be very, very dark, and in between street lamps there would be areas of pitch blackness. 2 weeks later, from Susan Ward's attack, on a Sunday, here, Commercial Road, in a van and cart builder's yard called Dutfield's, Louis Deemschutz was going to work. Now, he turned his pony and cart into the yard. As the animal began to shy, there was a dark shape lying on the ground. He carried on telling his boss there was someone sleeping it off in the yard. Sadly, that was not the case. This was the broken body of Elizabeth Stride. The police and doctor were there in minutes, and the body was still warm. It had not been long since she was dispatched. This is the best time for obtaining evidence. It was just after 1 o'clock in the morning. Lamps were brought to illuminate the gory scene. Her right hand was over her chest, yet covered in blood. The left hand was on the ground and held a packet of cashews. Now, I thought cashews were cashew nuts, but not so. It's a different type of cashew. Cashews were a lozenge for sweetening the breath used by prostitutes of the time to obscure the bad breath and dental decay that they suffered from some of their clients. These cashews were wrapped in tissue paper. As the doctor examined her, some spilled out. The woman's face looked very calm, yet the scarf she wore was pulled tightly around her neck, as if her attacker had used that to throttle her before committing the murder. The bottom of the scarf had been frayed, as the killer used the bottom edge as a guide as he drew the knife slowly across her throat. Dr. Frederick Blackwell concluded that she'd been dead for less than 30 minutes. The Ripper was nearby. The night that Ripper took another 2 lives. The victim was Elizabeth Stride, a woman who had her own coffee shop until her marriage broke down. She ended up in the workhouse and regularly suffered bronchitis from the dust, so to make up her wages, she began working on the streets, and it would end up costing her her life. And I know how easy it is to perhaps judge these people, but we should be a little bit more kindly towards them. This was the only way they could get by after being dropped in it by men who walked away. Alan Robson, we're on the trail of Jack the Ripper, and every step we take brings us nearer to finding out the real name of the real killer.
The Stride murder is different from the other Ripper crimes in as much as he didn't mutilate the body. But there are a number of reasons for this. One, the most popular explanation, is the arrival of a man called Louis Deemschutz, who'd been away at a market that day, and he arrived back with his horse and cart and discovered that he was the man who actually discovered the body. It's thought that his arrival, that the Ripper was probably hiding in the shadows somewhere and then made his escape whilst there was all the confusion going along following the discovery of the body.
The killer fled west a few blocks, encountering another woman outside a nearby church.
But of course in 1888 all the traffic was horse-drawn and moved at a much slower pace than it does today. So this made the street in front of this church a good place for the prostitutes to pick up customers. The only problem was that if the prostitute stood still and didn't keep walking about, then she could be arrested by the police for soliciting. So what the prostitutes did, they used this church like a traffic roundabout.
Fingerprinting and other now standard tools of detection was still a long way off.
It's going to be another 14 years before you get the first fingerprint conviction. Similarly, in 1888, the difference could not be told between animal and human blood. So you could have a situation where the murderer could be standing here and the victim could be lying there. The murderer could be covered in the victim's blood. He could have left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. With the state of scientific knowledge that existed in 1888, there was no way you could put the two together. The murderer has quite literally got to be caught in the act of murder.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Alan Robson walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. Suddenly, it's really cold. I don't know what it is, but it is really cold. Kenny's with me, waiting by the van in case we need to nip across to the next place. And Elizabeth Stride had been killed, and the police were there within minutes. But this was not the only murder of the night, as I got to just grab a whole batch of stuff here and start walking. And we've got to walk pretty damn quickly as well, because it was not the only murder of the night. It seems obvious that the Ripper was disturbed, probably by the pony and cart plodding towards the yard, and this gave the killer sufficient time to escape into the shadows before he could entertain himself by mutilating his victim. Now, by the time Inspector Aberline had been given full control of the case, he was a trusted policeman, a good policeman with a good mind, but already the facts of the case were being distorted by everyone. The police were spinning the story to reduce its impact on the public. The press wrote whatever lie would generate sales. But back then, people believed everything they saw in print. The public continued to believe it was a foreigner, probably a Jewish butcher or a Jewish doctor. To show you how easy it was to waste police time based on innuendo, they searched for 5 whole days for a man called Lipsky. As people kept saying, Lipsky is responsible, Lipsky is the Ripper. So they began to investigate, but they couldn't find anybody called Lipsky. Inspector Aberline was the man who stopped the inquiry. He knew that Lipsky wasn't the name of a person. It was the name that people gave to any Jew. It was a derogatory term used by racists who felt that the Jewish community had all of the money and they were jealous of their success. So let's look at the facts and the real evidence. A man called James Brown saw Liz and a potential punter at the bottom of a road. The man was unkempt, portly. He wore a long black coat all the way down to the ground. And Liz was heard to say, "No, not tonight, some other night." And the man just walked away. About 30 minutes later, Constable William Smith saw Liz, recognisable by a flower she wore on her jacket. He saw Liz with a man with a deerstalker hat and a dark, rather tatty-looking outfit. He was in his late 20s or 30s and clean-shaven, carrying a newspaper parcel in his hand. It was approximately 18 inches long and 6 to 8 inches wide. We're heading precisely to where the next murder was committed. Now, if this was the Ripper, he wasn't wealthy, for no one other than a common man would carry a crude parcel wrapped in newspaper. At the murder scene, an in-depth listing was made of what was around the body. Elizabeth Stride was about 42 years old, 5 foot 2 inches, with curly dark brown hair. Her eyes were light grey and her front 2 teeth were missing. She was wearing a long black jacket trimmed with dark fur and an old black skirt and dark brown velvet bodice. Add to that petticoats, a white chemise and white stockings. This look was topped by a black bonnet, boots, and pinned to her lapel a single red rose. All she had in the form of actual possessions were 2 handkerchiefs, a thimble, and some wool wrapped around a card for darning. Had the Ripper taken money? Of the previous victims, some rings were missing, some jewellery was missing, and not a single one of them had any money at all. They were prostitutes who'd been working all night. They all would have had money on them. Is this an indicator that the killer was farming his victims for money? None of his victims had a farthing. They'd all been picked clean. If so, the Ripper, painted as a well-to-do aristocrat, if he was doing this, he certainly wasn't well off. Just as the police were getting stuck into examining the body of Liz Stride, a cry came up that there'd been another killing. Aberline and his key men left the site of the murder to rush to Keeley and Tung's warehouse here in Mitre Square. The noise you can hear behind me that's nearly petrified me is a black cat with a collar around his neck, and he's coming to me. Yeah, boy. Meow. Hang on, this is the kind of rubbish you got to do to get a cat to come to you. Here, boy, you're very, very lucky. You're very lucky. Come here. Come on, boy. Unfortunately, Elizabeth Stride didn't have the good fortune of a black cat to cross her path. Coincidentally, you know, around about this time, and this is another important point for you to consider when you're trying to find out who the Ripper really was. Imagine if you knew there were murders occurring all over a very tightly packed area, you would flood the area with policemen. And that's precisely what had happened here. This is the cat's collar noise. Hello, puss. We've got a Whitechapel moggy. Dozens of police were on duty in Whitechapel to try and deter the killer, and one had found an apron lying next to an open door, and there above it, written with white chalk on a black wall, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Detective Hunt ordered that it be photographed and then washed off. Such outpourings of a racist kind were sadly commonplace in Whitechapel in those days, but really unlikely to have been the Ripper. His passion was of a far bloodier nature. Yet the press and the locals would use this as another excuse to persecute the Jewish population. Incidents included smashing windows, beating them on the streets, and several stabbings of innocent men and boys. The apron, however, had been cut off the victim, and it had been used to wipe the Ripper's hands after a particularly gory night's work. There was no trouble identifying the woman. A mustard tin found next to her body had pawn tickets made out to two women, Jane Kelly and Emily Birrell. Both names were made up, yet the items pawned were a pair of man's boots and a white flannel shirt, along with other items stolen from a punter she'd had sex with. So, pawn tickets from items of clothing from punters that she'd robbed, essentially. Catherine Eddowes had often called herself Kelly or Kate Conway, so she could not be traced after robbing a client. The boots belonged to an ex-boyfriend of 7 years who it appears had been pimping her out. John Kelly had told her not to get killed by the Ripper. Catherine had laughed at this, saying, "Don't you fear for me. I'll take care of myself. I'll not fall into his hands." So could Kelly be the killer? Could her ex-boyfriend and pimp be her killer? After all, his meal ticket had left him. Not only that, she'd pinched his best boots too. An article in the East London Observer newspaper declared that Eddowes knew her killer and that knowledge could get her killed. Was this true? Or had her ex, Kelly, used this as a way of making money from reporters? Was it because he was the Ripper? Well, on the night concerned, Catherine had been arrested for drunken disorderly after drinking away the profits of a night's illicit sex. She was still happy when, after a couple of hours, she was released from Bishopsgate Police Station. "Good night, old cock," she shouted to the desk sergeant, then blew him a kiss. She was back on her patch, right here, where we are tonight. Alan Robson with you, walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. This is Mitre Square. The time then was around 1 a.m. 3 men who'd been drinking at the Imperial Club just along the road from here had spotted a man and woman on the edge of the square. The man was not well dressed. aged around 30, 5'8". He had fair complexion and a small moustache, and when the men appeared, he turned his face away and walked with Catherine here into Mitre Square. As the apron was not there at 2:20, but it was there at 2:55, it is fair to assume that the murder was done in enough time for the killer to make his escape. Between those times, 35 minutes to grab, murder and mutilate, all within 30 minutes. Catherine Eddowes' sad end came to light with Dr. Brown's initial report. Brown wrote,
"The body was on its back, arms by her sides. There was a thimble on one finger of her right hand. The clothes were pulled up above the abdomen. The thighs were naked. The left leg extended in line with the body. The right leg bent at the knee. There was disfigurement of the face, the throat cut across. The intestines had been drawn out and placed over her right shoulder. They were smeared with fecal matter. 2 feet of intestines were cut out and placed between the body and the left arm. The lobe and the auricle of the right ear had been cut through and removed. There was a huge pool of blood flowing under the neck down to below the right shoulder."
The post-mortem was rather more graphic, adding the following perversions. The knife across the throat had cut down to the spine. The stomach had been cut upwards from the genitals all the way up to the chest. The liver had been sliced in two from inside her body. The murderer had almost cut out the vagina and the rectum. Dozens of separate cuts, incisions, slicing as if he was toying with her, in exactly the same way you would cut up a rat in a biology lesson at school. He had the power to do anything to this woman, and some of it whilst the victim was still alive and could feel every touch. Following this murder, the killer would have been covered in blood. The left kidney had been removed, the womb cut through and much of it taken. For the first time, the Ripper had attacked the victim's face in a merciless assault. Had he known the victim, or had the victim recognised him? It's well known in forensic circles that if a killer is recognised, he needs to disassociate with the victim, make his prey unrecognisable. In this case, he had cut into both of her eyes. Many newspapers had said that the last image seen by a murder victim is left on the eyes. Only the less well-educated would believe this, but was this just in case? Strange noise to my left-hand side is some kind of metal fence being rattled. There was a deep cut over the bridge of Catherine's nose all the way down to her jaw. The tip of the nose was detached. Another stabbed through the face and across the gum. In total, 14 wounds were delivered into her face, turning it into a mulch. The doctors universally agreed that this man could have no surgical experience at all. He was not a doctor, nor was he a butcher. The press ignored this, choosing to point fingers at anybody remotely interested in the medical profession. Or maybe it was a butcher, or maybe it was a tanner. It is safe to presume that the killer was polishing up his technique. This time, following being disturbed, Jack the Ripper had the audacity to use his near capture as a distraction to the police, and then he had gone about his way, determined to find another victim. Could you imagine? You've just almost been caught by the police, your heart's thumping in your chest, you're running away, you're hiding in the shadows, and then you spot another woman. He procured his next victim, and he went to town on her. The missing pieces of poor Catherine Eddowes were thought to be trophies, yet a poor kidney would return in dramatic fashion. Yet on the streets there was chaos and near anarchy. Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, they were well liked in Whitechapel. They were well known there. They knew everyone who lived in Whitechapel. And their murders, above all, generated a genuine fear among streetwalkers, and then within days a local militia was put together. This gang of mainly thugs began attacking foreigners, attacking butchers, pelting the coaches of any doctors passing through. It merely added a vicious, additional strand of misinformation to muddy the waters and actually help the killer vanish back into the shadows. Alan Robson, live from the streets of Whitechapel. It's freezing here. I hope you are feeling safe and warm in your beds, in your taxi cabs, in your homes. Tonight, I'm freezing for you as we begin to heat up our investigation so that at last we can announce the name of the man that took her life. We are on the trail of Jack the Ripper, and tonight he will be outed. Alan Robson, live from the heart of the East End of London, Whitechapel, walking in the footsteps of the Ripper.
Following the double event, police patrols in the area increased dramatically with undercover detectives, some disguised as women working the docks. Police also posted warnings for women to stay off the streets. But for the East End's prostitutes, this was hardly an option.
The murders are concentrated in a very, very tiny area. And there was an absolute terror in the Whitechapel and the surrounding districts. You have this enormous petition put up from the women of Whitechapel, 40,000 women petitioning Queen Victoria, sort of to get something done about the murders.
The Queen responded to the petition by contacting the police authorities and writing a letter to the Prime Minister.
This new, most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity for some very decided action. All these courts must be lit and our detectives improve. They are not what they should be.
So, as we went through this, it became very, very serious very early on. As probably to a certain extent that questions were being asked in Parliament, and Queen Victoria got involved, the monarch at the time. It was asking questions, and government nearly fell on this.
In a last-ditch effort to counter mounting criticism, the police consented to using bloodhounds in the investigation. Commissioner Warren volunteered to play the fugitive during a test manhunt in Hyde Park. Unfortunately, the dogs were unable to follow his scent, and the failure heightened the public's ridicule.
Jack the Ripper is a sexual deviant whose attacks become, to my mind, increasingly frenzied. He runs risks, but nobody actually sees him committing any of the crimes, despite the fact there are considerable numbers of people about on and
walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper along a long street. There's cars parked either side because obviously the East End is lived in. Families are here. There's two-storey houses, lights on, people snuggling down for the night, and that blasted cat looks like he's following us. And he is. No worries. The upper echelons were becoming increasingly disturbed by reports that the police didn't care for the working classes. There's nothing in comparison with how the women of Whitechapel felt. Many would not cross their door unless they had a man by their side, or 3 or 4 of their friends. At night time, the working girls continued to ply their trade. They took every safeguard possible. Some only went with a client, provided that he was introduced to her colleagues or introduced to a pimp. And this put off an awful lot of punters, and times were desperate for prostitutes unable to make their rent. Landlords universally ignored the Ripper as any type of excuse, and dozens of prostitutes were evicted around this time. The police hunt continued, and the press tried to paint the picture of a well-heeled doctor hiding in the London fog, ready to leap out on unsuspecting prostitutes. Everything about this picture was wrong. Follow the evidence. The Ripper was not remotely wealthy. Coroners and doctors agreed he only had a very basic knowledge of anatomy. Witnesses to earlier crimes had all agreed it was a shabbily dressed man of around 5'8", with a moustache and bad skin. 3 days later, the police found another body. A good distance away from here, but in Whitechapel, on the embankment of the Thames, a warehouse had been broken into and the torso of a young woman was discovered. No arms, legs or head were anywhere to be seen. 10 days later, the arms were found further down the river. She was never identified. Most police officers refused to accept that this could be the work of the Ripper. However, that didn't stop the press from initially printing headlines like, "Latest Ripper Butchery. The Ripper strikes again," and even "Police helpless over Ripper massacre." Why let the truth get in the way of a good story? This may have been the Ripper trying something new. He had tried to remove Annie Chapman's head, yet there were none of his obvious signatures. His ego would certainly have made him leave some kind of clue, you would imagine, as he toyed with a totally ineffectual police investigation. 5 weeks after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, surprisingly the people of Whitechapel were beginning to think that the Ripper had left the area. The only horrific event was the kidney that the Ripper had sent to George Lusk. A whole month without a killing. Maybe it was someone who had been robbed by a prostitute, who had made his point and now moved on. Theft from a punter was commonplace. The easiest trick was, whilst the punter was on top of the woman, trousers around his ankles, it was easy to pick his pocket and hide the money, or to hide his wallet in her undergarments. Yet at 10:45 a.m. on Friday the 9th of November, John McCarthy was checking his books, only to discover that Mary Kelly was 29 shillings in arrears with her rent. That was a small fortune at this time. He sent a lackey called Bowyer to her flat to get some money. Kelly had told him she was going to watch the day's Lord Mayor's parade, and on getting no reply, she may already have set off. As we head towards that area, into the blackness, and sometimes we see a courtyard and it's just pitch black, and we're walking into that courtyard right now. Many working girls merely pretended to be out to avoid the rent man, so Bowyer walked around the side of the building to a window where 2 of the dirty panes were broken, and he peered inside. As his eyes became accustomed to the darkness, he saw a heap of flesh oozing blood onto the table. On overcoming his shock, he focused on a bloodied body on the bed and turned and ran. When the police, accompanied by Dr. Phillips, pickaxed the door down, it was obvious that the Ripper had been at work again. The body was unrecognisable as a human being. Had the eyes and brow not been intact, a basic identification would never have been able to happen. At the present moment, we've got leaves directly above my head of a huge tree that is kind of covering this long and dark alley that heads further and further into the blackness, and it was along here that in a tiny little house the body was discovered. The room was searched and scant regard was paid to the blazing fire in the hearth, so hot that the spout of a kettle had melted off. This was thought to be the Ripper burning wood and clothes to give him light to carry out his horrific hobby. Yet the clothes were not just women's. There were signs of a grubby man's jacket and shirt. The police disregarded this as being the Ripper's because it was old and cheap. There had been a number of people who had heard "murder" shouted late in the night, and on having investigated, nothing was found. A number of witnesses said they'd seen someone talking to Mary just before her murder. Others claimed that they'd seen the same man earlier looking down the lane where she lived, to the area where I'm standing now. This man did not come forward, despite exhaustive enquiries and the newspapers asking him to step forward. Dr. Bond, another police doctor, made notes as he investigated the initial scene. Here's part of his actual report.
The body was naked in the middle of the bed, shoulders flat. The legs were wide apart. The entire surface of the abdomen and thighs were removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated, and the face hacked beyond recognition. The tissue of the neck was severed down to the bone. The viscera had been placed in various parts of the room. The uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been put under the head, the other breast by her foot. The liver was between her feet, the intestines on her right-hand side, with her spleen on the left. The flap of skin from her thighs and abdomen had been put in 2 piles on the table next to the window. The face was gashed in every direction following a furious assault. The nose, cheeks, eyebrows and ears had all been partially removed. The lips were cut several times, all the way down to her chin.
There was one mistake in his report. Mary was in fact wearing a small chemise-style corset that had been obscured by blood. Once again, the destruction of the face suggests that the killer knew his victim and was trying to remove any trace of her, for he would feel guilt mutilating her if she was a friendly, dead face. As the inquest began, some of the witnesses were whispering that the witness who had not come forward was George Hutchinson. Realising the police would soon come knocking, he walked into Commercial Street Police Station. He'd already been questioned by the police near the scene, and he'd told them that he'd been nowhere near at the time and that he didn't know Mary Kelly. Here is the statement that George Hutchinson made, completely changing the story.
At 2 a.m. I met with the murdered woman, Kelly, and she said, "Hutchinson, will you lend me 6pence? I told her I couldn't. I'd spent all my money going down to Romford. She said, "Good morning then. I must go and find some money." She walked towards Thrall Street and a man tapped her on the shoulder. They burst out laughing and I heard her say, "All right." He then put his hand round her shoulders. He also carried a small parcel in his left hand with a strap around it. I was standing under the lamp at the Queen's Head public house and I watched them. They came past me and his head was stooped down, out over his eyes. I bent down and I looked at his face. It seemed real stern. They went into Dorset Street and I followed some way behind. They stood on the corner for a few minutes and I heard her say, "All right, me dear, come along, you shall be comfortable." He put his arm on her shoulder and kissed her. He pulled out his red handkerchief and gave it to her. They went down into her court. I stood there for about 45 minutes, but it didn't come out, so I went away. The man was about 5'6", aged about 34-35 years of age, with dark complexion, big dark moustache turned up at the ends. He had long eyelashes and blue eyes. He was wearing a long dark coat trimmed with astrakhan fur. He had a white collar, black necktie in which he had affixed a horseshoe pin. He wore a dark pair of spats with light buttons over button boots. Displayed from his waistcoat there was a massive gold chain. His watch chain had a big seal with a red stone hanging off it. He had a heavy moustache, dark eyes, bushy eyebrows. He had no side whiskers, and his chin was clean-shaven. He looked like a foreigner to me. The small parcel he carried was about 8 inches long. It looked as if it was covered in American cloth. He had brown gloves, he walked very softly, and I believe he lives in the neighbourhood. I fancied that I saw him in Petticoat Lane one Sunday morning.
Inspector Aberline saw this statement as a major breakthrough, and was now more sure that he would capture this gentleman killer. On the 19th of November, thousands lined the route of poor Mary Kelly's funeral procession, as it was taken for burial to St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. Many say the Ripper was in the crowd, amused at all the fuss that he'd caused. As we step out onto cobbles down a long, dark alleyway. This alleyway stretches about 200 yards into the darkness, and we're walking further down towards it. The following day, perhaps spurred on by his increasing celebrity, had he struck again. A working girl, Annie Farmer, picked up a client who she'd often seen in Whitechapel, a regular face. 2 hours later she ran out of her kitchen bleeding from a wound in her throat. Other lodgers in the George Street house raced to help her, but the man ran from the house. He climbed a wall and ran into Thrall Street and vanished in the crowds. Lots of leaves under my feet, as you can probably tell down this back alley. Annie said that the man was in his middle 30s, 5'6" to 5'8", with a dark complexion, a black moustache and no side whiskers. He was wearing a shabby suit, a battered black felt hat, and he looked common but respectable. The police thought this to be a pimp trying to get more money from one of his whores, as some girls hid coins from their pimp, hiding them in their mouths. Or was this just the Ripper seeking another kill and another Few shillings. A month to the day in November, the police found another body. She hadn't been robbed, as she had 1 shilling and 2 pence in her purse. Her clothes seemed undisturbed. The woman was Rose Milet, a woman thought to be a prostitute. Earlier that evening, she'd been approached by 2 sailors, and people heard her shriek at them, "No, no, no." Hours later, those sailors had found a willing woman and had caroused at the George public house on Commercial Road, so they're unlikely murderers. Initially it was thought that Rose had been strangled by a ligature, and thumb marks were also found on her neck. Later the marks were said to be commonplace on women wearing stiff, starched collars. Other doctors said she'd choked on her own vomit whilst drunk, yet a verdict of murder by some person or persons unknown. Was this totally unrelated, or had the Ripper tried to throttle another woman before toying with her, perhaps leaving her when she vomited on him, and that disgusted him? 6 long months passed, and more body parts were found in the Thames belonging to Elizabeth Jackson. The parts were wrapped in her clothes and showed signs of mutilation and amputation. The crime was never seriously linked to the Ripper, but should it have been? If you think about it, Annie Chapman, the Ripper had tried to remove her head, unsuccessfully. Another torso had been found. It had been some 7 months since Mary Kelly had been hacked to pieces. Other bodies had been found, yet still the police manipulated the spin in an attempt to calm the fears of the people of Whitechapel. Sergeant Edward Badham had experienced the Ripper's brutality face on. He had the dubious pleasure of taking the blood-soaked corpse of Annie Chapman to the morgue. He'd just exchanged words with one of his constables, Walter Andrews, as they walked past one another on Castle Alley. Seconds later, Andrews saw the bleeding body of a woman. That alley is about 150 yards ahead. In the shadows again, between 2 gas lamps. How had the sergeant missed that body? Right from the beginning, a police officer, a police doctor had been on the list of suspects. Could it be a policeman? We've said it could be a doctor. The press were determined that it was going to be. But could it have been a police officer? Yes, whilst looking at the bleeding body, obviously not long dead, he heard footsteps further up the alley, and instead of following police procedure and stay with the body, Andrews was up on his toes and giving chase. They found a couple of men claiming to be going to McCarthy's, the chandler, the man who was Mary Kelly's landlord. Their names were never taken, but they were identified as people who had given previous statements to the police. Suddenly, it began to rain heavily, and the evidence, along with the victim's blood, began to run along the gutters of Whitechapel. To run along the gutters that I'm walking in right now, that's swathed in leaves. Like all of the Ripper victims, their head had been turned to the right, and there was a deep incisive wound to her throat. The lady's clothing had been pulled back, and the underwear removed. There was a wound in the abdomen, but no sign of mutilation. Once again, it was as if the killer had been disturbed, and not for the first time. The woman was eventually identified as Alice Mckenzie. Alice had occasionally worked as a prostitute, but had been living with a fellow and trying to manage living without doing that. The police pathologist, who had been ordered by the Home Office to downplay the Ripper murders, declared that this was obviously committed by another killer. However, Dr. Bond, who had examined previous victims, told the press that he had no doubt at all this was Jack the Ripper's handiwork. Subsequently, officers agreed that the political pressure put on detectives had made it impossible for them to catch the real killer. There were even more twists and turns to come, for on Sunday, the 8th of September 1889, a man in New York called John Cleary waltzed into the office of the New York Herald and declared that Jack the Ripper had struck again. He said that London police had found another body in White Horse Yard, near where Liz Stride had been butchered, directly across the road from where I stand now. At first, this was treated as a hoax, until in Pigeon Street, which is just around the corner, they found the torso of a woman. Her head and legs had been removed. There was no blood anywhere, and the body had begun to rot, and the stench was vile, creeping around the chest and making at least one officer to vomit. A couple of Chavas to the starboard bow, so if you hear noises, bear with us. The cause of death had been a violent cut across the throat, identical to Ripper attacks on at least 3 earlier victims. There were no mutilations, but in at least 2 previous cases, the killer had tried to remove the heads of Mary Kelly, and before that Annie Chapman. There was a rip right down the centre of the abdomen, exposing the intestines, but this time none had been removed. John Cleary knew of the body, yet had not been officially found. How did he know? He was either the killer, the Ripper, or he knew who was. Finally, a news vendor claimed he'd made up the name Cleary, and whilst living in London, he'd heard a man in a uniform say, "Hurry, there's been another horrible murder." So the puzzle becomes even more complex. Was the killer a policeman? Did the police find the body earlier, but choose to hide it so that the Ripper legend could die down and stop the whole frenzy from getting even worse? Arnold described the man as in his early 30s, wearing a dark uniform. His height was around 5'8", with a fair complexion and a moustache. He was carrying a small paper parcel around 8 inches in length. His clothes were rather tatty and old. Was the Ripper posing as a police officer to attract his victims? Dozens of other prostitutes were missing, but an official identification of this body was never made. By now, the press were also off track by accepting weak police evidence, distancing the Pinchin Street torso from the entire Ripper investigation. They ran a story asking readers if they knew a husband who no longer lived with his wife. They believed the murder to be a domestic incident. This completely ignores the facts. Realistically, the police believed the Ripper had stopped long ago and had left the area, died, or returned to his previous life. They were soon going to be regretting their stance on the evening before Valentine's Day in 1891, over 2 years later. Ernie Thompson had only been a policeman for about a year when he was given his first ever night shift. At 2:15 in the morning, he was walking his beat, and on entering Swallow Gardens, which is just ahead of us, he heard footsteps racing away from him. As he tried to focus beneath the dim streetlights, he saw a woman in great distress. The woman's throat had been sliced and blood was pouring from the wound. This rookie was in shock too, blowing his whistle over and over and over again as the woman opened her eyes and locked onto him with a deathly stare. Dr. Oxley was first in attendance and declared the throat had been cut in a sawing motion, as if it had been an attempt to remove the head. By now that dim spark of life had been extinguished in a lady whose name was Frances Cole. It was obvious that the murderer had been disturbed, and her clothes had not been removed, nor had the lower part of the lady's body been mutilated. On these facts alone, it was discounted as a Ripper killing. The police were desperate to continue believing that he had gone long ago. Out of all of the crimes that were committed in Whitechapel, you now have heard all of those that are or could have been associated with Jack the Ripper. Gather your evidence. Who do you think is the most likely killer so far? Alan Robson. Tonight we're tracking down, we're chasing. He has nowhere else to run. Tonight we will let you know, and let you perhaps make the decision as to who is Jack the Ripper. Alan Robson, live from the streets of Whitechapel, avoiding Chavas, trying not to be knocked down by cars, and heading into one of those buildings. We're heading into there next. Do come with us.
During the late 1880s, in the wake of Darwin's theory of evolution, criminology linked human behavior to biological factors. Distinctive physical traits and facial features were believed to reveal criminal types, but were seen as more ape-like creatures, not as fully developed as most humans. Research into this area probably did little more than reinforce prevailing ethnic stereotypes and prejudices, and it likely had the police and the public looking for the wrong man. In fact, what might have served the Ripper best was a deceptively ordinary appearance. one that would not draw attention during a time of great fear and suspicion.
We were not dealing with a rocket scientist in this case. We said that he lived right in that location. He was very, very comfortable with those crime scene locations. Very, very comfortable because, as I recall, in one case, a police officer walked by and saw the victim, came back 20 minutes later, and the victim was found dead at that same location.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Now, at the present moment, I'm in a building in Mitre Square, directly above where a body was found. This is the place where Catherine Eddowes, on the southern corner of Mitre Square in Aldgate. The murder took place on the 30th of September, the same day as the murder of Elizabeth Stride, and it was left in an appalling state of mutilation, as we've already heard. But for us to be in this building is absolutely superb. And we're going to let you hear the sound of the Ripper. We're going to give you his words. Between the attacks of Susan Ward and Liz Stride, a letter was sent to the Central News Agency, and it read, "Dear boss, so now they say I'm a yid. When will they learn, dear old boss? You and me know the truth, don't we? Lust can look forever. He'll never find me, but I'm right under his nose all the time. I watch them looking for me, and it gives me fits. Ha ha! I love my work, and I shan't stop until I get buckled, and even then watch out for your old pal Jackie. Catch me if you can. Jack the Ripper. P.S. Sorry about the blood. Still messy from the last one. What a pretty necklace I gave her." And as Susan Ward survived, he was referring to Annie Chapman's cut throat. Or perhaps he had thrown her attached entrails over her shoulder. The police and press thought that this was unlikely to be the killer. After all, he could not even use basic punctuation. His spelling was appalling. This didn't fit the profile of a rich gentleman. On the 27th of September 1888, another letter in similar handwriting arrived at Scotland Yard. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I've laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on oars and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I loves my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went stiff like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha! The next job I shall clip the lady's ears off and send the police officers just for me jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do's more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I wants to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off me hands, curse it. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha! Now, whoever wrote this had little or no medical knowledge, as it came as a surprise to them that blood would clot. So if the Ripper did write these letters, he was obviously uneducated and not a doctor, yet still almost all their inquiries were in that area. Could it have been a double bluff? Could it have been a doctor trying to appear uneducated and a novice in all things anatomical? A postcard arrived at the news agency on the 1st of October 1888 in the same handwriting as the previous letter. I was not coddling, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. One squealed a bit, couldn't finish her straight off. Had not got time to get her ears for the police. Thanks for keeping the letter back until I got back to work again. Jack the Ripper. A communication was underway. Within 24 hours, the bodies of Liz Strayed and Catherine Eddowes were recovered. 5 days later, on the 6th of October, Jack became angry and once again, in the same hand, sent a threatening letter. You thought yourself very clever, I reckon, when you informed the police, but you made a mistake if you thought I didn't see you. Now I know you, and you know me, and I see your little game. And the light just went off, and that freaked. Don't know whether you heard the click, but the light just went off. I didn't touch it. Did you touch it? Jeez. The light just went off. And we're directly above where Catherine Eddowes' body was found. Anyway, Jack the Ripper continued. I see your little game, and I mean to finish you and send your ears to your wife. If you show this to the police or help them, if you do, I will finish you. It's no use you trying to get out of my way, because I have you when you don't expect it, and I keeps my word, and you will soon see that I rip you up. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. P.S. You see, I know your address. It had actually been sent to the man's home. It was sent to one of the witnesses, who then retracted his statement, but did hand the letter to the police. The killer, Jack the Ripper, obviously lived in Whitechapel. He knew who was saying what. He knew who they were talking to. No doctor would know that. It had to be a man in Whitechapel. A letter from Galashiels in Scotland that would lead the police to suspect Scott James Maybrick, a Liverpool merchant, of being the killer, read, Dear boss, I have to thank you and my brother in trade, Jack the Ripper, for your kindness in letting me away from Whitechapel. I'm now on the road to the Tweed factories. I will let the Innerleithen constable or policeman know where I am, for I'm about to start my little game. I've got my knife replenished, so it will answer both ladies and gents. Other 5 Tweed ones, and I have won my wager. I am yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now, was this a copycat? Because no Scottish murders would ever match the Ripper's fingerprints. Was it merely a holiday where the killer toyed with the police, dragging them away from London? The most infamous Ripper letter was sent to the leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, George Lusk, along with part of a human kidney taken from the body of Catherine Eddowes. This would be known for all time as the From Hell letter. It's written, From Hell, Mr. Lux. So, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved for you. To the piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that I took it out with, if you'll only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. Many believe the writer could spell, but chose to misspell. However, following the kidney's inclusion, there was no doubt this man was the Ripper. Dr. Openshaw confirmed the kidney was Catherine Eddowes' left kidney, the one that had been cut out, probably while she was still alive. This led to him receiving a letter from Jack. Old boss, you was right. It was the left kidney. I was going to operate again close to your apostle. Just as I was going to draw my knife along her bloomin' throat, them cusses of copper spoilt the game. But I guess I'll be on the job soon, and I'll send you another bit of innards. Jack the Ripper. P.S. Oh, have you seen the delve with his microscope and scalpel a-looking at the kidney with a slide cocked up? The letter is proof that the writer was more literate than he tried to suggest. In previous letters, he knew knife began with a K, and he correctly spells kidney when previously he didn't. After the death of Mary Kelly and the attack on Annie Farmer, a letter written on newspaper arrived, marked Liverpool. Dear boss, look out on the 7th inst. I'm trying my hand at disjointing. If I can manage it, I'll send you a finger. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. So now you've had the Ripper's own clues. However, we must also remember in recent times the Yorkshire Ripper investigation was sent on a wild goose chase following receipt of a tape recording thought to come from Sunderland, where that man claimed to be the Ripper. Eventually the hoax was revealed, and literally hundreds of man-hours were wasted whilst Peter Sutcliffe continued to kill. Next, who are the real suspects? Alan Robson, about to unearth the name of Jack the Ripper. Walking in his footsteps, Alan Robson live across the world.
...1888, and they've been going ever since. He's been an abortionist, he's been a female abortionist, Jill the Ripper.
One of the more bizarre ones, quite recently, and I find this really bizarre, is that of Lewis Carroll. The author of Alice in Wonderland has now been named as Jack the Ripper. And then, of course, in recent years we've had a whole range of theories built around the British royal family in the person of Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of Clarence, who dies within 4 years of the Ripper murders.
The royal theory is in fact a theory involving the Freemasons, in that the Duke of Clarence, or as he was then the Prince Eddie, the son of the Prince of Wales, and heir presumptive to the throne, was involved in a liaison with a Catholic girl, which would obviously not be the thing for a member of the royal family to do.
According to this theory, the Ripper's last victim, Mary Kelly, knew of the prince's illicit affair and was blackmailing him. This led Sir William Gull, the royal doctor, to kill Mary and the other prostitutes. A Freemason, Gull then supposedly left the mutilated remains of Kelly and the others as an ancient ritual punishment for betraying government secrets.
There was an account, a Masonic account, of the punishment by the biblical King Solomon of the 3 Jews who are said to have murdered his master mason who built his Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And according to this Masonic account, these 3 Jews were punished by the biblical King Solomon by having their throats cut, their breasts burst open, and their bodies scattered. And in the Masonic references to those 3 Jews, the word Jews was spelled J-U-W-E-S, exactly as it was written in this doorway over here. So how Eddowes died and the spelling of the word Jews, that is what has led to the suggestion that the murderer was either a Freemason or knew something about Freemasonry.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Alan Robson with you live. And at the present moment we're in that room, we're in one of the upstairs rooms in Mitre Square, directly above where Catherine Eddowes was murdered by Jack the Ripper. We're in search of a monster, a man who slaughtered women and hideously mutilated their bodies. Now surely that should be the easiest thing to do, to find out who committed these crimes. Once you have your suspects gathered, rather like Hercule Poirot in the drawing room of fiction. Yet the truth is that almost any one of the suspects could have done it. It's now up to you to decide who Jack the Ripper was. Now, the only thing I haven't provided you with, well, that's the alibis of all of the contenders. And once you have that information, then you can name who the Ripper is. And you'll have been armed with more information than the... Did you hear that creaky noise? My good gracious. Directly behind me there was a strange kind of creaking there. I don't know whether you picked that up on the microphone. So Kenny and I are here in the dark of a very, very tall room. And it's the kind of room that has... What do you call those things where you've got like a curtain, like a picture rail very, very high, and then another yard of ceiling before you hit the actual ceiling itself? Obviously, a lot of these buildings have been redone. There's modern lamps here, and yet there's an uneasy feeling, a feeling like this is a place that's been stained by something from the past. So, with more information at your disposal than the police had at the time, ignore the press, because we've taken you through what we have. You haven't seen a single newspaper headline. Now, at the time, they were all telling you, it's a doctor, they're looking for the doctor, Dr. Death, Jack the Ripper, the upper class, the aristocrat, maybe the royal, perhaps. All of these things, the Jewish person, the foreigner. The newspapers kept sending the police and the public in the wrong direction. So with more information than the police at the time of the killings, let's look at the alibis of the people concerned. The first name has to be the Duke of Clarence. As a royal living in London at a time of extreme poverty, the jealousy of the poor pushed him to the very top of the list. However, he knew nothing of Whitechapel's back streets, the alleys, and the back lanes that had allowed the killer to escape on at least 4 occasions. He was said to be gentle and reserved, funny, with a kindness towards people. He may or may not have been bisexual, as he often entertained men and women. So what proof was there? After an early murder, a witness saw the royal coach drive by. No idea who was in it, but the Duke admitted it was him. He had occasionally joined a number of aristocrats for a night of whoring after slipping out of the palace. In effect, not one shred of evidence, but it allowed the press to have a field day at his expense. He had no motive to kill. Take this a step further forward and look at the crimes that he could not have committed. He was out of London on at least 4 of the attacks, and he's got witnesses in Scotland to prove it. However, his status could buy an alibi. Sir William Gull is the next possible killer. Many said that he was going out with the Duke to cover up the heinous hobby of the royal. Then the Freemasons were charged with protecting the killer, who was one of their numbers. They would never betray a fellow of the lodge, not for a few filthy prostitutes. Once again, the press are thought to have invented the initial hoax that tied Gull to the prince, and also linking in the Freemasons. If you think about it, people who haven't got much are quite happy to believe that the killer's one of the rich, rather than somebody that's living amongst them. Gull was a good doctor. He was brilliantly skilled. He was humane without any trace of motive. Also, his fitness was really poor. If he walked 30 yards, he was panting due to a lung condition. It was impossible for him to run. He couldn't climb a fence. Once again, no proof whatsoever against him. Whilst 2 of the victims were being ripped, he was delivering babies. Or was this a fiction to cover the fact that he had blood on his hands? Dr. Rosalind Donston lived in Whitechapel. He knew it really well. He had nerves of steel. Yet, in fact, his real name was Robert Donston Stevenson. He got into the occult. He began to restyle his image in keeping with the likes of Aleister Crowley, the other Satanist who would follow him. A calculating ex-soldier who was known for meticulous planning in all of his military campaigns. And even though he seemed fit, he was 47 years of age. Could he really outrun a 23-year-old policeman? He was also 5'10", and he wore heeled boots that made him look at least 6 feet tall, with a top hat on his head. The motive given him was that he sought power for his perverted black magic delusions. However, he was never remotely involved in black magic ceremonies involving blood sacrifices or of any living thing. A rumour abounded from an ex-girlfriend that he had a box full of bloody ties, perhaps dipped in the blood of each victim, as a trophy. This was never proven, and it was later discovered the girlfriend sold the story to the press. Later, Aleister Crowley claimed that he once owned that box of ties, but at the time he was trying to build up his image as Britain's leading occultist, and he'd also claimed to have owned Excalibur. He dumped his girlfriend, and this could easily have been the vengeful action of a woman scorned. He wrote about the murders in the press. Was that the perfect cover for a killer? James Stephen was considered to be the Ripper. On one occasion, a crowd pelted him with vegetables and stones when he walked through Whitechapel Market. He was a homosexual who hated women, following a childhood raised by an abusive woman. Some said he was sold to men who were allowed to sexually abuse him as a child. Others claimed his mother was a prostitute. He was very fit, a proven sportsman, but he had no knowledge of Whitechapel. His motive could have been sheer hate against the trade that his mother adopted. However, there was no proof, and he had alibis that the police checked for all but one of the crimes. He had brain damage, he was driven mad, and he knew Druid, another suspect. Inspector Aberline thought it was he and Druid working as a team. If one had an alibi, the other would not. So maybe there were two killers. So what of this other guy, Montague Druid? He had a knowledge of the area, he had an office on the edge of Whitechapel. In his case, his mother was driven mad, and following her death, he wanted to commit suicide. He loved women, though, and he didn't have really a motive to kill them. In fact, there was no link between him and prostitutes at all. He was found dead in the Thames on December 1888, and this was said by many to be the Ripper, ending his own sad life. However, that doesn't answer the question of those women attacked after that date. Or was that merely copycats? Although his name is often mentioned, the only evidence against him were a set of faked documents that were put together by a journalist to get a cheap story. There are more suspects. No wonder the Ripper has remained hidden under a shroud for so long. Well, we're going to give you the last of them. After this, Alan Robson with you and across the world on the web. Have you decided who the Ripper is yet?
Jack the Ripper's not finished.
The FBI categorized the Ripper as a disorganized killer, one whose methods are erratic and impulsive.
We thought that because of the locations where he committed 4 of the 5 crimes. They were outdoors, they were on the streets or in a courtyard, a very high-risk crime. In other words, whoever this person was almost oblivious to the risk. All the bodies were quickly discovered. So there's not a great deal of planning that went into those crimes. All of those things told us that we were not dealing with a rocket scientist in this case. We said that he lived right in that location. He was very, very comfortable with those crime scene locations. Very, very comfortable because, as I recall, in one case, a police officer walked by and saw the victim, came back 20 minutes later, and the victim was found dead at that same location.
Others believe the Ripper fits the description of the organized offender, citing his ability to engage his victims, the consistency of his methods, and the fact that he left few clues.
Profiling is the study of an unsolved crime of violence with the goal of arriving at characteristics and traits of the unidentified offender. Age, race, marital status, arrest history, educational history, that type of thing. The purpose of a profile is not to identify a particular person, but rather to identify a personality.
Alan Robson with you on the trail of Jack the Ripper. And as the net begins to tighten, we have a few more suspects, including Walter Sickert. He was also linked to the Masonic conspiracy. He was in the same lodge as Gull. He took lodgings after the third murder near Whitechapel, living next door to a veterinary student whose name was Hewitt. The press would later say that it wasn't Hewitt, it was Druid, because it sounded like it. But actually, Hewitt was a fit man who would often walk late at night in his top hat and long black coat. There's no motive, no proof against him, but he worked with animals. So we've looked at the richer suspects. What about the common man? Now, George Hutchinson was spotted near 4 of the killing sites just before the bodies were found. He lived in the middle of Whitechapel. Everybody knew him. He was out drinking most nights, like so many others. He was at very least a witness, yet he only came forward to give a statement to the police after 8 other people mentioned that he was there. He was the right age, the right height, and he knew at least 3 of the victims. Mind you, most of the male residents of Whitechapel knew the working girls as they patrolled their patch. Hutchinson did not work, yet he always had beer money. Many believed him to be a thief. Local pawnbrokers had rings, hat pins, and jewellery from him. Frederick Downing was another vicious young man. Fingers were pointed towards him. He hated women after being abused by his own wife. He eventually killed her and his second wife, who was also a nag. He then butchered his own children so he could have a new start without them. He was fit, perfect height and build, with a sworn hatred of prostitutes, as the only one he'd slept with had robbed him. Many locals swore he was the Ripper, but his alibi was airtight. He was in prison at the time of the killings. One of the most likely suspects was George Chapman, real name Antoniowicz Klasowski, a Polish immigrant who worked in Whitechapel. He knew it well. He was a calculating, manipulative, and cunning man. He lived on his wits and won a lot of money gambling and probably cheating. He was very fit, and he gained pleasure from killing animals, like many killers, and gained sadistic pleasure from beating up women. His second wife knew Annie Chapman and introduced her to this Chapman. Over the years, George had married 4 women, each one dying in a tragic way. Yet following a post-mortem, poison was found. Previous wives were dug up, and his serial killing was exposed. Poisoning was his method of death, a cold-blooded and premeditated crime, not the blood-soaked frenzy of the Ripper. He was too tall to fit the pattern. He had a huge black moustache and sideburns of a vivid type. He would easily have been identified. William Henry Bury was 29 at the time of the murders, once a horse-meat butcher who used to run a brothel. He murdered his wife by choking her with a rope and then stabbed her and wedged her into a trunk. He walked into a police station and confessed in February 1889. On getting to his home in search of the body, they found graffiti outside the door saying, "Jack the Ripper is at the back of this door." And on the stairs down to his flat, more graffiti, "Jack the Ripper is in this cellar." The finger pointer was not a good speller, but his wife Ellen's body had been terribly mutilated, her intestines protruding through the stomach. He was tried for her murder and hanged in Dundee on the 24th of April 1889. A known thief. The murders started after he arrived from Scotland and ended after he was hanged. Neighbours say it was his own wife who believed he was the Ripper, writing that graffiti herself. However, the Ripper may well have committed more attacks after that date. Thus it could have been coincidental that he would butcher his wife that way. Also, Bury took his wife on a holiday to Wolverhampton in 1888, and whilst they were away, Martha Tabram and Mary Ann Nichols were ripped to pieces. Or did he pop back? No wonder the police had so much trouble. We had in trouble too. So many potential killers, including Frederick Charrington. Now, he was a Christian zealot, lecturing against drinking and harlots. He was the right age, size and shape, and he lived alone as a celibate, obsessed with the sleazy world of the Victorian prostitute. There's no proof whatsoever, but his obsession made him a suspect. Aaron Cohen was arrested in December 1888 during a police sweep of brothels following one of the murders. Many believe his other name was Aaron Kosminski. He was in an absolute frenzy. He was sent to a mental hospital where his violent behaviour included attacking and trying to kill other patients. He died in the mental hospital the following year. Could it have been that he was the Ripper and he was celebrating one of his murders by immediately having sex with another prostitute? So who do you think it was? You must ask yourself, who is the perfect package? Who has the motive? Who had the opportunity? Who lied? Who could be easily lost in the Whitechapel crowd? And more importantly, who was Jack the Ripper?
We had available to us the autopsy reports, photographs, crime scene sketches, a map of the area in which the crimes had occurred with the location of each of those crimes. We also had, most importantly, the victimology. The people who were, in fact, the victims of Jack the Ripper, we had their history. They were all prostitutes. They were all derelicts, alcoholics. They all lived in the same vicinity. They were all mutilated in a very, very similar manner.
If you accept this guy had a pathological hatred of women, maybe that is what he would take. That is what he would see as, you know, the thing that a woman's got and a man hasn't. So maybe he if he hates women that much, the uterus and the womb is the thing he will cut out, because that defines a woman.
By mutilating the victim, he in a sense neuters her. He desexes her, and she's no longer something to fear. And he also has that opportunity to carry out all of his anger, which is primarily directed toward women. Jack the Ripper is motivated by anger and a sense of fear toward women.
Walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we were going around Whitechapel, we left recording devices at the sites of some of the Ripper murders. Admittedly, there are long periods of silence on these recordings, but when the sound begins to happen, it's well worth a listen. This recording was made in a building directly overlooking the spot where Liz Stride lost her life. Now, when you record things in empty buildings, you've got to leave them there for 4 or 5 hours. It's not like you can just book a ghost to appear on demand. However, this next one was placed in Mitre Square, place where the double attack took place. He didn't do a very good job of Liz as well, you know. And this is where he moved on to show his true brutality with Catherine Eddowes. You're not going to believe what we caught here. Now, we have to admit, we did set up 7 recording devices in various places. Some of them gave us just the kind of noises that any house would experience. But we've saved the best till last. In that tiny little room where Mary Kelly was done for in the most horrific of fashion. We caught this. It's incredible. And I must admit, if ever the idea should be questioned as to whether we should place recording devices in empty rooms, this is absolute proof of the pudding. Brace yourself. This will make you uneasy. So, you've had all of the suspects, you've had all of the people that historians think could be Jack the Ripper. And yet, they all made that same mistake. They never counted the early assaults as being Jack. Now, if you do, and you find out who was available to be the killer, you discover that an awful lot of those big names get crossed off the list pretty quickly. So do you think you know who Jack the Ripper is? Would you have been wiser than the police of the day to capture the monster of Whitechapel? Well, next, we're going to find out.
End of London at Christmas 1888. Now that tells you that the police officers then were pretty sure they knew who Jack the Ripper was. To actually cancel all the aid at that early, only a month, 6 weeks after the last murder, tells you they knew, they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that they knew who Jack the Ripper was.
Alan Robson with you live from directly above Mitre Square in the heart of Whitechapel, directly above where one of the Ripper's victims was mutilated, and badly so. It's now time to unmask Jack the Ripper. I believe that right from the beginning of the police investigation, they were looking for the wrong type of man. The police of that time were used to dealing with domestic incidents, husbands killing wives, wives killing husbands, not cunning serial killers. The streets were flooded with the police, and the already crowded streets would make it impossible for any stranger not to be noticed after so many forays into a very closed community. If we look at the search for the Yorkshire Ripper, the huge breakthrough was that cassette tape with the Geordie voice. It wasn't even a Geordie voice. It was a Wearside Mackem accent. Yet that tape led to hundreds of thousands of man-hours being wasted. Anyone without a northeastern accent was discounted, allowing Peter Sutcliffe his freedom to kill at least 3 other women. Sutcliffe often made deliveries to the northeast of England and had even tried to snatch 2 girls on the Team Valley trading estate in Gateshead before he was eventually caught. One of those girls rang the Night Owls. He'd been interviewed, Sutcliffe, by the police 8 times. The same level of misinformation happened back in Whitechapel. But tonight we'll capture Jack using logic and common sense. Look at the clues, because they are there. Dr. James Macmillan, an American profiler, has put a Ripper profile together. He said this: as a child, he would kill or mutilate animals, bullying fellow school children and wishing that he could kill them too. Most serial killers are white and begin to live out their fantasies after the age of 25. I think Jack was aged between 27 and 35. He lived in Whitechapel, and his face would be known by everyone who not only knew him, but probably liked him too. He would kill where he felt safe and knew he could easily make his escape. His home was likely nearby. He would have a lowly paid job if he had a job at all. He was certainly not in any well-paid profession. He was either very calculating or possibly a paranoid schizophrenic. The killings were totally disorganized, so the rest of his life would be too. A tatty home, shabby clothes, no organization in his life. His teeth would likely be decayed, his hair not neatly trimmed, and his personal hygiene lacking, and he would probably be infested with lice. The prostitutes would have known him, as no decent woman would share his bed. They would feel secure with him, as he was a local character. He was their perfect, regular customer, in fact. He would also visit all of the pubs in Whitechapel and kept his violent tendencies well hidden. That from a profiler. Who fits that picture? This discounts 3/4 of the suspects at a stroke. Any of the rich and wealthy were instantly picked out by pimps, prostitutes, and the local vigilantes. Towards the latter days of the Ripper, everyone was so keen on watching out, no stranger could enter Whitechapel without being challenged. The Ripper was a local. So out of the 3 or 4 local men, who lied? Only one. George Hutchinson, who had failed to come forward after a dozen folk saw him near Mary Kelly's murder site. When the police sought him, he then came forward and gave an incredible statement giving the perfect description of the wealthy killer, the well-to-do Ripper who took Mary Kelly off to her doom. Despite only having a split second to see the man under dim gas lamps, he still managed to give a 4-page description of a man covering the type of jewellery he had on, how long his eyelashes were, his cuffs, his shoes, the fact that he was a toff. This statement alone led to thousands of wasted police man-hours. Why would you make all of that up unless you had something to hide? Was this to cover the fact that you were there next to the scene where a murder would be committed? The first attack was not a fatal one, but Annie Millwood was attacked within 2 blocks of where Hutchinson lived. When she eventually died, Hutchinson would have gained confidence from this. Hutchinson's next victim was Martha Tabram, just around the corner from his house. Then going a little further away to dispatch Mary Ann Nichols on Bucks Row. This would lead on to his greatest mutilation so far, Annie Chapman, and then the stealing of her rings that he was known to pawn. Almost all of the victims had been without a penny on them, at a time of night when they would have been carrying all of the profits of a night's work. This killer was also a thief, maybe living on his murderer's booty. Then on to the mutilation of Catherine Eddowes in the street directly below my window. But he was clumsy. He got fecal matter on his hands from ripping open her bowel. He wiped his hands on a cloth cut from her clothes. The cloth was dropped on a direct line between the murder and Hutchinson's home. All of these killings, whilst the police and public searched for the toff carrying the little leather doctor's bag, not the newspaper-covered parcel that Hutchinson carried. Liz Stride, Annie Farmer, Rose Milet, Elizabeth Jackson all suffered at his hands. Hutchinson's confidence must have made him think he was immortal, even though the police could prove he was actually in the courtyard near Mary Kelly. They still hadn't arrested him. He was sufficiently cocky to kill Alice Mckenzie almost within sight of his own front door. So what happened to him? According to the census of 1891, George Hutchinson was no longer in London. His neighbours said he left early in 1889, around October. Around the provinces, other women were ripped, their bodies torn apart, and in America too. This man, George Hutchinson, is the only one who fits. He lived almost in the centre of the area where the rippings were done. He was so well known to all the working girls, he became almost invisible. He was the right age, the right height, the right weight, and he was certainly fit enough. He was not a madman, nor would he be the sort to take his own life. He enjoyed the game far too much. The only reason he would stop is for purely self-preservation. Where did he go? Did he have children? Are they out there now carrying that murderous spark in their DNA? One dark night, on a narrow street, as the fog rolls in, perhaps one unlucky woman will find out to her cost. We'll listen for her scream.